called moral distress. I'm looking to address the gaps that existed. Anyone that wants help, we're going to give it to them. And when these stresses build up and then it just suddenly hits us, we do need to kind of bring physical health and mental health together.
Leaders in history have said that you won't be able to really create anything if you're worried about what people might think.
This thing called SMART goals, like setting goals that are specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, time-oriented.
You could be your best friend or your worst enemy.
You know, it's a little bit every day, and you see that you've actually gone.
Open the door for therapy as an option. Work. People care. Systems. That wasn't an acceptable answer, and maybe.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of our special series podcast, Half Full. Half Full is a podcast that aims to inform and empower people to take the first step in their mental health journey. We want to help facilitate those important conversations about mental health, whether it be about self-care, general well-being, or some serious topics like mental illness. We understand how overwhelming it can be to just try and figure out where to start when it comes to mental well-being. Our goal is to educate people about mental health and nutrition and encourage them to take action in real life. My name is Tiwi, and today I'll be one of the hosts. I am an economics major at the University of Ottawa.
Thank you, Tiwi. Welcome to our special podcast. I'm Gaurav Singh, entrepreneur, sports coach, and sports president, UBC SOTA. And today we have a very special guest. He has over 20 years of diverse social experience, which includes probation officer, hospital social worker, qualitative researcher, counselor, and clinical supervisor. He is currently a community partner in a national study led by the Center for Addiction and Mental Health on culturally adapted CBT for South Asian populations. He has been a community consultant for a study on acceptance and commitment therapy for Asian men, led by SFU, and one of the handful educators across the province offering free training on motivational interviewing online. Honestly, I could go on about him for 10 more minutes, but to all the viewers today, we have with us Gary Thandi. Welcome, Gary. How are you doing? And why don't you just tell a little about yourself to the viewers who might be seeing you for the first time?
Sure. Thank you for having me. So my name is Gary, and I was born and raised in a small town on Vancouver Island, Campbell River. And I was born and raised there, went to university at the University of Victoria for my bachelor's in social work, and eventually moved to the mainland, and that's where I am now. I live in Surrey, British Columbia. As you mentioned, I've worked as a probation officer. That was my first sort of post-bachelor's career, and did that for several years, and decided at that point, well, I was working with adults, and I thought, well, I'd like to work with folks before they get to this place and hopefully prevent some of that from happening where they get into criminal justice system involvement. And so went back to do my master's degree in social work, and then have, as you mentioned, some of those other different initiatives I've been part of, and really focusing on how do we support people, and how do we, through counseling, through social emotional support, and I'll talk more about that, of course, but just how we can support people before they get to a point of, significant struggle. I've also at some point tried to work on a doctorate, but I took a bit of a break and haven't been able to go back, but that's also on my bucket list of getting back to do my doctorate.
Awesome. So like from the beginning, you were very clear about this path, as in these services to be provided to the society, or was there say a turning point in your life that made you go in this direction?
Absolutely. The turning point was when I started to work in a nonprofit that was doing excellent work. And I was doing counseling, and then eventually moved more into sort of leadership and management and supervision of counselors. And so I was often reviewing the intake. So anybody that was reaching out for service, And I was finding that we were having to put people on these very long wait lists just because the needs outstrip the resources, or we had certain funding that established who we could work with, so we would turn people away. And that was a big piece for me. I thought, here are folks that are struggling, and it takes so much courage to even reach out for help, and then to be turned away or told, okay, we will help you, but it'll be a year from now. I was really struggling with that. And I didn't even quite put my finger on it. I learned years later, there's this term called moral distress. I was struggling with having to turn people away. And so that was a big turning point for me. And yet at the same time, what I realized was I mentioned in my bachelor's in social work, I've done those degrees, and I had practicums as part of that. And I had great mentors. And so it was something that just for me, it was just a given that I wanted to pay it forward. I wanted to be a mentor as well when I had the opportunity, because I had such great experiences. And so that was the other sort of realization for me, was that there's all these great students that come with such great knowledge and great skills. And that's when I started the agency that I in 2016, Moving Forward Family Services, which was really the strengths of students. So there was that frustration I had, right? The distress. But on the bright side, I saw this great potential of the students with the right mentorship, with the right support to address the needs. The other observation I had was, it's our system that's sometimes getting in the way of supporting people.
Yeah.
Yes, there's a lot of need out there. And yet when we tell people, well, you need to fit all the check marks, or, that we only have, a limited fund that only allows for a certain service, like, we're asking folks to fit into our parameters. And I don't think that's acceptable. I don't think that's how we should be doing things. We need to look at each person and determine what their needs are, and then try to address the needs in that way. So really what it was, okay, I was trained to work with many different populations. I think our students in counseling and social work, they're also trained that way. So I'm not going to limit their abilities. I'm going to give them the opportunity to work with anyone, whether it's children, adults, seniors, families, couples, extended families. That was really, the awakening for me, I guess, was okay. I just don't want to turn people away, and I want to actually serve them in the way that they need the service and the support. So anyway, started the agency by basically taking students, providing mentorship and support, and offering an open service to anyone that wanted it. Knowing that, yes, they are going to work with students, so they're newer in the field. But for me, I was just always very impressed with what those students can do, right? So I wasn't looking to replace what was already there. I was looking to address the gaps that existed.
Interesting. And like really getting to the source of it while addressing mental health. There's a sharp incline of mental health issues among people, like say if we compare it to Gen X, then millennials, and then Gen Zs. It's a sharp incline how the number of mental health issues among people are growing. Why do you think, like, first let's address this, why do you think, what are the like root causes of why are these increasing day by day? Is it because of social media, increasing competition? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's many factors. I always think that it existed. I think people's struggles existed even among baby boomers and the next generations. I'm Generation X, and I think I've noticed, or as I've reflected, a lot of times people dealt with their stress by maybe not in the most constructive ways, maybe by drinking or like substance use, right? And that still I think happens for sure. So I think there's greater awareness of these issues and greater discussion of these issues. I've got two boys that are in the K-12 system, and I've certainly noticed that it's being discussed more, right? Which I think is a great step in the right direction. There's a greater acknowledgement. My frustration sometimes is that the fact that, yes, there's greater discussion, but the resources have not kept pace with that. So we have a lot more people now acknowledging their struggles,
Yeah.
But the resources still aren't there to support those folks. So that's again where I try to put a lot of my energy. I think social media, I think people openly discussing these things, these are all steps in the right direction. I do think there's additional pressure when it comes to these additional mediums that we have that can sometimes, we are bombarded by sometimes what expectations of us are, which are often unrealistic. And but those are often creating additional kinds of stressors on people. I think, I was born in a small town, and when I first moved here, I noticed how everyone's quite busy, and there's just, there's obviously more traffic, and there's those kind of things that do impact people as populations grow, and those kinds of stressors can exist, right? But I think it's a great sign that we're talking about it more.
Yeah.
But we also need to make sure that when people, as I mentioned before, if people are reaching out for help, the worst thing we can do, frankly, is to say, okay, yes, you need help, but we have nothing for you. And so we need to sort of keep pace with that increased awareness.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that, because I think it's the same thing we see in like universities where like you would reach out for help with issues relating to mental health, and then there's usually like this long wait line, like what you said earlier, where it's like, yeah, now there's more people talking about mental health, but there isn't like enough resources. It gets to a point where it's like, okay, yeah, we hear you, but then we wouldn't be able to get to you till like a month from now, which is also part of the reason why we started this project as well, to let students know that, okay, there's so many resources out there at the same time, so there's always, you should maybe like have like a backup plan, like, okay, if you reach out to this resource and it doesn't work, there's always like, a different one. So yeah. And I also appreciate the what you said about it was less about like replacing what was already there, but more about filling the gap where, like, there's people that come in for help, and then just because they don't fit into a particular box, they're not able to receive the help that they need. So I think that's really nice as well.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I just, it was that I felt, as I said, again, very personal for me, just having to turn people away. I didn't get into this work, nor have I ever come across anyone else that got into this work to turn people away, right? That's unfortunately part of how our systems are set up. And again, when you have a great need and limited resources, but it was really wearing on me, and I could see myself burning out, right, from that. And so I decided, and it took a certain amount of privilege. I've been doing the work for years, and I'd noticed these things. Gaurav, as you mentioned, with all the different things I've done, I've seen some amazing, wonderful people doing amazing work.
Yeah.
But we're all talking about the same issues, about just the need being so much greater than what we could offer in turning people away. And what our clients are often telling us as well is that, they did reach out for help and they were turned away, or a door was closed. And I love what you said, Tiwi. It's like, we want folks to also not give up and continue to try. But I also know a lot of times people are already quite, impacted by depression or anxiety or other mental health issues or substance use. And so it could be debilitating. They're already feeling a certain way. And so when a door is closed on them, it's, so we want to empower them to keep trying and find the resources they need. But again, I'm from the other side as well, where I'm like, we also need to be accountable and not do these things and just kind of assume. Like, we talk about, mental health is health. I love that term, but I also feel like, if you injure yourself, there's a chance you can get treatment fairly quickly.
Yeah.
You don't have the same kind of responsiveness when it comes to mental health. And that's something that, yes, we need more resources, but we also need a more integrated system of support. And that's, and again, I take ownership of that. I've contributed to the fragmented system that exists. So I also now want to contribute to a more integrated system.
Okay, that's great.
So you mentioned about moving forward family services that you opened in 2017, 2016.
2016.
2016, and you're the executive director. So why don't we educate the viewers about what does moving forward family services do?
It was really just, there was a term that we use often. We were trying to innovate by simplifying. we basically said, anyone that wants help, we're going to give it to them. And we're not going to limit it based on, what their presenting issue is, whether they have a diagnosis or not, the geography where they're located. We're not going to limit it based on age. Like, I find like a lot of these things are frankly somewhat arbitrary. They're based on, government funding, and you have different ministries, and you have different, like, then because they have a finite amount of funding, then they decide who their population is. I get it. I'm not naive. I've been around long enough to understand why it exists that way, but it's creating the same gaps that we then identify as problematic, right? That it's the service is becoming so restricted based on that limited need. So I wanted to go the opposite way and say, no, we have these very skilled people that can provide support to anyone.
Yeah.
And we're going to have a wide open mandate that you can, originally it started as, based in Surrey. So if they could come to our offices, but, COVID obviously has been horrible in so many ways. But one of the bright areas for us was once we went to online service, we actually expanded considerably, because now we didn't just, clients didn't have to come to our physical location. So now we're across Canada through online means. And again, the agency is really, that innovation by simplifying. Basically, you don't need to, jump through hoops. You don't need to fit this criteria. If you want the service, we will provide it. And the other part is finances, because, private therapy is quite expensive and not affordable for a lot of folks. So I didn't want that to be a barrier. So your financial circumstances will not be a barrier. If you cannot afford to pay, we have certain services. If you can afford to pay, great, because that also helps cover our expenses. But again, that won't be a reason to be excluded from service. So anyone, again, that wants the service will provide it. I've got about 200 students on practicums across the country. I've got about 100. It's something I never planned, but something that was really exciting is there was a lot of folks who really valued what we were trying to do. So they kind of came on board and supported our mission and our vision. And so I have therapists as well who are willing to provide service. So if somebody doesn't want to work with a student for whatever reason, even though I think students are fantastic and they can do amazing work, but they can also access a private therapist at a sliding scale that's considerably more affordable than traditional services. So we have this menu of options that we can offer. I have about 100 private therapists. I have about 15 supervisors who then support the students and the therapists, and to make sure that we are doing the best clinical work possible.
And that's very true, because while doing our primary research, so we sent out a survey across Canada to respondents to respond about questions for mental health. And one of the biggest concerns was, I'll quote, just give me a second. So some of the major questions was that the therapy is too expensive. How should I access it? And so there is still not a lot of awareness about moving forward, that there are societies and companies like this who are making these services available at a much affordable rate, and that to everyone, and in a very accessible way. I love that term, innovation, but through simplification, because the more it is simplified, it adds to the innovation. So there needs the awareness is still needed about that these services are available to everyone, and that too, it doesn't matter what you have, you could just show up and you could get help. So this awareness is still needed.
Absolutely. I mean, again, we've only been around a few years. I've been around longer, part of being a nonprofit is limited funding and limited revenue, excuse me.
Yeah.
And so it's the constant education and awareness raising, right? That it's not always easy to do because there's only so few of us to do it, but it's through venues like this, just to be able to discuss that we are an option that's available. We're not, a great fit for everybody. We may not have the services someone's looking for. Often, a lot of our counselors as students are new. So if somebody is looking for somebody with, 10, 15, 20 years experience, we're not the best option. But having said that, I know that often somebody would look for something like that, but they may not find that, certainly not at an affordable in an affordable manner. So yeah, I think it's constantly just kind of raising awareness, letting people know what resources exist.
Yeah.
And just not to toot our horn, but I think we are quite unique in our model. And something I also didn't want to do was compete with other nonprofits. It's a system that sort of pits everyone against each other for these funds, right? And I don't think that's the best way to develop an integrated collaborative system. So those are systems issues. And again, things I do like to point out is that we want to have a better system of support for our clients, the people that are struggling, but we need to have a better system that allows us to collaborate and contribute to that integrated system.
Yeah.
Very, very interesting.
So I wanted to ask, you mentioned that with COVID, after you guys moved your services online, you were able to expand across Canada. So does that mean that you now take clients outside of just BC? So like students from all over Canada could not only, because I saw on your website that you guys do have positions for internships, and I think you already like mentioned that with how you do work with students across the country, but does this mean that students outside of BC can also access the services that Moving Forward offers?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, I always encourage folks to, see what's local, because that's ideal. Like if they could find a resource closer to home. But I can also share that most people, when they do reach out to us from Ontario or Alberta or the Maritimes, is or anywhere, really across the country, that they've tried and they've looked and they weren't able to. So we always encourage folks to, get on whatever wait list they have to locally, or if it's a more specialized service. But again, we just want to support them. We don't want them to suffer, while they're waiting for that service to start.
Great. And like, would you have any advice for any students who don't think it's necessary to talk about their mental health, or who don't think they have time because of like how much work it is that they're doing with school or whatever?
Great question. One of my goals is to normalize, that everybody struggles. Not everyone has clinical depression or some clinical diagnosis, but you can't live life without experiencing certainly bouts of depression or anxiety or self-doubt or stress or loss, right? It's inevitable. And I think part of our messaging is everyone should see a therapist just for their own self-care. It's just the same way people go and do yoga regularly or work out regularly or go for hikes or just socialize. That should be an option as well. So what I would tell students is, a lot of these stresses build up and then it just suddenly hits us. It was things that we were feeling, but we were kind of pushing away. And then quite often it'll just hit us and we'll have these really tough days. And service is still available then, but I would love it for people to kind of, do regular maintenance. Let's do preventative work. Let's talk about these things so it doesn't get to a point where it's debilitating. And again, not to always pick on the system, but again, the system often like the service isn't sometimes available until you're very unwell. And even then, sometimes the only resource is maybe hospital, for example. And I think I don't want people to get to that place. Or as I mentioned, when I was in probation, I don't want them to get into trouble with the criminal justice system, or I don't want them to use substances as a way to cope. So whatever we can do to reach people before they get to those places, again, we'll still support them at any point in that continuum. But if we can reach people sooner, that's ideal.
Great, thank you.
And like while doing our research, we found that like there are a couple of stigmas when it comes to counseling or therapy. Firstly, I would like to ask for the viewers, would you differentiate between therapy and counseling, and how?
I mean, we often say they're interchangeable. It's I know sometimes people define them differently. I tend to use them this in a similar way.
Okay.
I mean, we've even got folks that sometimes call them classes, right? And even though it's one-to-one, right? It's just whatever terminology, but in my mind, they're very similar. And But there are different resources for different, like if you want psychological assessments, that's not something we typically do. That's something a psychiatrist or a psychologist does.
Yeah.
Therapy, in my perspective, or counseling, is just really to come and discuss anything that might be impacting you on an emotional level, right?
Okay.
And so, and even that piece around stigma, I think the best way to, again, I keep picking on our system, but there's room for improvement. I always say I'm grateful that I live in Canada and we have the resources we have,
Yeah.
but that doesn't mean that there isn't room for improvement and we can't do better.
Yeah.
And for me, the best way to reduce stigma is to, when people come forward, to give them the support they need. Again, if mental health is health, then we need to treat it the same way as we do with physical health issues. And so people should be able to access services right away. I could even share an example, like, I worked with quite extensively, I'd say, with South Asian communities.
Mm-hmm.
And I had an opportunity to do some research as well on intimate partner violence in South Asian communities. And something that came up quite often in the literature is around how we do need to kind of bring physical health and mental health together. And so something we do in Surrey is we have some services at a medical clinic. And so you have your doctor there and you have your counselor there.
Okay.
And I thought one of the best ways to deal with stigma is you're going to the same place to deal with all your health issues, right?
Yeah.
So we even had people that said, I'm going to my medical appointment or I'm going to the doctor's. They were coming to see the counselor, but that's how they framed it. And it was almost a way to kind of move around that stigma. Like maybe if their family doesn't, approve of them going to counseling, they don't even have to say they're going to counseling. They're going to this one place where they're getting all their healthcare needs met, So it's that one-stop shop model that I think, I wish we could do more of that everything is in this one place.
Yeah.
And it's all considered health.
Yeah. That would also eliminate a lot of anxiety in people making that first call, that getting to call the counselor or the therapist and going there, because so I'll point that out to our research. So there were three main stigmas that our research pointed out. Is first, men are supposed to be tough and they are not to be seen as like they should go to counselors. Firstly, secondly is the judgment, worry about what people might think if they come to know we are seeking or one person is seeking counseling, and thirdly, a overall stigma that people who are weak seek counseling, or cost, do not like the idea of paying to share feelings. So these are the quotes that I'm quoting from the research we've got from the real respondents across Canada. So this is based on our research, and yeah.
I mean, these are all things we need to deal with. Even I realized at some point as a male and a male from the South Asian community that I'm going to talk about these things. I'm going to say I've struggled with anxiety. I still do. I've had significant loss in my life. I've utilized substances in a very maladaptive way to sometimes cope with my emotions. And that to me is some way, hopefully, that's a way to normalize that. Here I am, and I feel comfortable as a male saying that I have had these struggles. And I think, I've also noticed that sometimes those kind of, stereotypes of what a male should be, for example, it's really hurting the male, and it's often limiting their ability to enjoy their life to the full capacity. And I think they need to understand that those kind of, sometimes those gender roles, the same way it impacts women, it does impact men. That, when you think that you should only be a certain way and you should be stoic and not share your feelings, it's actually, it's limiting your enjoyment of life. And so I think the best way to bring down those stigmas is for people to speak openly about it. And I think, again, that's something, despite my issues with our systems, I think that's something I'm happy to see, is more people are speaking up, more men are speaking up. But again, I think, I also worked at a place where, sometimes they would say, well, they're just not coming for service. And they were talking about men, in particular, South Asian men in that example. And I thought, well, instead of saying they're not coming, we need to ask, what do we need to do differently to engage them, right? Because I almost felt like it's an excuse not to try, just to say, oh yeah, they're not going to come. And so that's not to say stigma doesn't exist, but what are we doing as a system, and what are we doing within our fields to try to reduce those barriers so that it is more accessible?
And what advice would you give to people who are worried about judgment?
I mean, typically, and this maybe sounds harsh, but sometimes the most judgmental people are the ones that, are not the kindest, I'll say, right? And maybe they've got their own struggles. So I say
Yeah.
that with empathy, right? But it's your life. And if you really want to enjoy your life, then why not, right? And again, I get when there's a significant cost. So and there's other places as well, but I say, give it a try, connect and see if it is something that you want to do, and it's not going to be, very costly for you to do it, and see if it is something that would benefit you. So that's the advice I would give, is just,
Just
you
like,
gotta live your life, right? Like, it's your life, and if you're
Yeah.
struggling,
Yeah.
then who
Yeah.
cares what other people have to say? I know it's easier said than done, but it's your life, and you want you to be happy. So what can you do to make your life?
all great leaders in history have said that you won't be able to really create anything if you're worried about what people might think, because
Yeah.
their job is to think, and it's their problem. It's in their mind. It reflects their personality and not yours. So that's
And I think ultimately you have to do what is best for you, right? You can't sit and let yourself, let your mental health or your like general well-being, just keep depleting just because you're scared of like what other people are gonna think about you the whole time. They don't know that you're going through what you're going through, and would probably advise you to reach out for help as well. So, I think ultimately it's just you have to put yourself first in such situations.
Yeah, I remember as a student, I dropped out of a class in university because there was too many presentations, and I had anxiety around that. And I realized at some point that is preventing me from, doing what I want to do, my career ultimately. And so for me, it was, eventually I explored medical options. I did training on how to do public speaking with others that had come there because they were struggling. And so that was something I had to realize, like, this is impacting my life, right? I have to do something about it. And again, as I mentioned, I still have, some of those struggles, but it was just recognizing that I need to do something about this because it's impacting my quality of life.
Yeah. So I think something that's more, I guess, common these days is people, self-medicating with whatever vices, to sort of like ease the difficulties that come with mental health. What advice would you give such people? I mean, like everybody says, reach out for help, but beyond just like reaching out for help, like, are there any extra steps that you would tell them, okay, yeah, I think this and this might, make your situation better?
I think you just have to be honest with yourself. Like, of course, some people can socialize using substances, and
Mhm.
if that's just something you're able to do, and you do it on occasion, more power to you. But if it's impacting you, if you're finding you're doing it more often, you're having to use more of it, then perhaps it's becoming a bit of a problem for you. And so you have to be honest with yourself, because we tend to minimize those things sometimes in our own minds, like, no, it's not really a problem, or we compare ourselves to that the addict that we may know that's using every day. But I just think about how you were, your relationship with those substances before. Has it, are you using it more often to just kind of cope with things that you're upset by? So be honest with yourself. But beyond that, it's like, as I've said, like, explore other options. Therapy is not for everyone necessarily, right? And I also don't think therapy should always be the answer. Sometimes, like, even presenting it like, just go to therapy and everything will be fine. No, that's 1 hour in your week that can be incredibly impactful, for example. But you also need to look at other ways to, maintain your emotional well-being. And again, that can be socializing, it can be working out, it could be yoga, it could be breathing exercises, it could be using apps, right? Like, that's another great thing in the last decade or two is just the introduction of these different apps, and some that are free that can help you do, engage in mindfulness or sort of breathing. So any kind of self-care maintenance thing that you can do, it's great for your emotional well-being, but it's just great for even it improves your sleep, your overall sleep quality. It improves your overall, relationships, right? Because you're not necessarily as stressed when you're doing those things. So then when you're engaging with others, the interactions tend to be maybe a little more pleasant that way.
So, do you have any favorite resources outside of therapy that you like to use? You mentioned some apps. I don't know if you have any apps that you use, because I've tried some of them before, but I just forget to keep going back to update them or follow up with them. So.
Well, and again, not to just I've noticed that as well myself. I've done that where I've had apps and I, download them. And I could be quite diligent, and then I get sidetracked a bit. We actually have these programs we call coaching programs, because I realize it's great if you're self-motivated enough and can stay that way to use those apps, but a lot of folks can't. So we actually, we have people that will kind of work with you to do mindfulness, and so it's a live person that kind of holds you accountable, right? That you have this meeting that you're going to be with. And so that's beneficial for someone that struggles with those motivations, including myself, that, it can fluctuate quite regularly. Beyond that, it's just, it's remembering to do that whenever you can. Sometimes it's only when you're feeling a bit overwhelmed that you realize, but it's not too late. It's just maybe getting better over time at recognizing, your body's going to tell you, right? Your body keeps score. It physiologically tells you when you're going to feel headaches, or you're going to feel soreness or stiffness. You're going to feel certain things, or even shallow breathing that you might be starting to kind of realize. And so becoming a little more aware of your body and doing regular body scanning. In terms of apps, there's some good ones out there. I've used Calm and Headspace, and some that are free, some that are, there's fees attached, but a lot of them will give you, a week's free trial, so you can kind of at least get a sense of what works. And if you have someone that you're, a good friend that you can just debrief with regularly, right? And if they're able to do that with you, that's wonderful, right? Other than that, just trying to get out, enjoy the weather, and get fresh air wherever possible. It's again, you have to kind of think in a more holistic way. And again, it's easier said than done, but it's okay, for me, medication route, I can explore that. Therapy, I can explore. Exercise, trying to do some mindfulness on a regular basis. Sleep hygiene, making sure that I'm not looking at this. And again, I've been guilty of that, looking at screens before bedtime, looking at the phone, but really trying to put that away. Obviously not, having any caffeine, later in the evenings. Just a lot of things we can still try to do preventatively. And then also recognize, despite all those things, you might have really bad sleep one day, or you might just have a day where you're not feeling well. And just, taking it easy on yourself. That's something, again, it took many years for me, is my own negative voice. That's still there, but it's also been replaced by a lot of positive things. It just say, okay, you know what, it's a bad day. And from experience that you may just have to ride it out. And then, tomorrow there's a good chance it'll be better. And so it's okay if you just need to kind of, not do much today and just.
Gary, one question, why is it that the mind keeps coming up with this negative thoughts? Because as a sports coach, I talk to a lot of sports players, and even the best of players who know who's going to win the match. They're pretty nervous and negative self-talk of, okay, what if I lose this one? Well, if it's pretty obvious, it's the game of that person and he's going to win it. That negative self-talk, why do you think mind tends to do this?
It's just human nature. I mean, we are our own worst critic, right? That's even, again, that example I gave of being anxious giving presentations. I had to realize at some point, what? Everyone kind of feels this. Yeah. Everyone has these self-doubts. Everyone feels this way, and I'm magnifying it. I'm making it a lot bigger than it is. But it is human nature. We are our own worst critics. In many ways that there's positives to that, right? That's what drives us. When we feel stress, it's a sign that I need to do something about this. It's only when it's debilitating or chronic and we haven't really tried to address it, or just we've struggled to address it. So even recognizing that, okay, I'm falling into that pattern. And I need to kind of replace that with a more positive coping, right? More positive thoughts. But not to get upset with ourselves when we do it, because it's human nature. It's actually quite normal. It's natural. We are our own worst critics.
Yeah.
But to also, when that happens, to remind ourselves to take it easy on ourselves.
Yeah. There's a very famous quotation, you could be your best friend or your worst enemy, your mind. So but to keep your mind consistently on positive thinking, that's a major struggle that basically everyone deals with. So that goes to my next question. What advice would you give to keep consistency? Because after talking to you or after seeing this podcast, a viewer might be inspired or motivated for 1 week, 10 days, but then consistency falls after that thing, and then coming to your program as well. So I would love to, the viewers would love to hear you about this.
It's to look at things. When I worked the direct service, I was doing like addictions work, and part of addictions recovery sometimes is relapse. It does happen, right? It's common, right? So how do we frame it in a way where it's not a negative? And my feeling is always, okay, so if you had been using a substance every day, and then you went 3 or 4 days without using it, and then you relapsed, instead of looking at that as a failure, say, okay, I was actually successful for 3 or 4 days. So there were certain things I was doing really well. Reflect on those, celebrate those, be proud of those things.
Yeah.
And maybe then set yourself a challenge to say, okay, I did it for 3 or 4 days. Next time now I'm going to try for 5 or 6 days. Yeah. And so it's kind of creating those goals and setting those goals that are feasible, right? Too often somebody says, and this is even the nature of New Year's resolutions, where, you just kind of just do this kind of thing in the new year, and then it tends to falter by, January, February, going to the gym. And then by end of January, it starts to kind of falter. It's just recognizing, again, it's to some degree human nature, but don't look at those as failures. Look at those as successes, and reflect on, okay, what went well and what maybe didn't I do so well that I can try to build on. So, like incremental steps. And we have this thing called SMART goals, like setting goals that are specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, time-oriented, right? You can always look that up, but it's just kind of, it's setting goals that are feasible, right? So, if you had like the resolution, if you haven't worked out in years and now suddenly your plan is to go to the gym every day and do heavy cardio or weightlifting, that may not be feasible. It's your right to do that, but you might want to set it up like, okay, maybe I'll go a couple of days, and maybe I'll kind of set it up a certain way and then see how that goes. Too often we set these very, lofty goals, and then when we don't reach them, it becomes kind of self-fulfilling, like, okay, I failed, and then you kind of give up. And we're saying, again, it's human nature to do that. So let's try something different with a bit of guidance and support, and then see how it goes from there.
Yeah.
I actually find that really helps me, but I didn't know that it was called like setting SMART goals. I just call them baby steps. And and that's what I always give to my friends, like when they ask for advice, like, well, they want to start this and they don't know how they're going to go about it. And like, it's such a huge project, or like, they're trying to change something about their behavior or something. I just remind them, like, you have to take baby steps, it's a little bit every day, and you see that you've actually gone a long way, and it does make a difference. Even like when you're thinking about stuff in general, you're able to see, okay, I've been able to do this much, so I can definitely do the rest. So I find it also pretty encouraging. So yeah, definitely.
And recognizing that change doesn't happen in this kind of upward trajectory, right? You often see that, and this is really what it is there's a little bit of a step forward, maybe a step back, and you can but you're still trending in the right direction. But again, there's some things
100%.
where it's better than others. And then, so instead of really looking at in a very minutia way, the day to day, look at where your progress has been over a week or two, and reflect on again, because it's human nature to just reflect on the negative things that happened, or the failures as perceived, but look at the successes, right? Even if they don't seem too big for you. That's something else I've often said is like, sometimes you think it's not a big deal, but people around you will notice significant things, and it'll be significant to them. So, something that you thought was no big deal, it's a big deal, right?
Yeah.
And good for you for being able to do it.
Yeah. And TV, adding to your point, baby steps, we call it gradual progression in sports. So it's just a matter of terminology. And and learning from these things you're saying, it all comes down to self-care and self-compassion. You need to find because the other day we were podcasting with Alvis Ram. He's a renowned psychologist in Alberta. So the same thing, you need to find your source of power, and you need to do it consistently. And then only a therapist or a counselor can also help you, because at the end of the day, you have to help yourself.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And surround yourself with others that, can fill your cup, that can, support you, and you can support them. And I mean, I think that's great. But again, if someone doesn't have that, then there's other, plans you can make to try to help you kind of progress along.
Yeah, and yeah, I would love to hear about that program that you mentioned about, in which people, if they find it difficult to get consistent, the program is there to help.
I'm glad you brought that up. It was something I realized as well. Like, a lot of folks may not feel like they need counseling. Maybe they don't, and so, but what they can learn, something that has been talked about often is, I wish we learned more about how to manage stress, how to deal with anger, how to communicate when we're frustrated within the schools. I think some of that is happening, but it's been a slow, it's been slow in terms of those kinds of changes. So we decided to create these kind of programs, like life skills, like how to, like we talked about the negative thinking, like, ways to recognize that and replace that with more positive thinking. So we have a life skills one that's, how to kind of, deal with stress and different techniques. So it's more educational or more psychoeducational. We have another one on healthy relationships. So when you're in a relationship, an intimate partner relationship, what are some of the skills you can utilize to build and strengthen that relationship? And then we have another one on mindfulness. So it's someone that you're working with that's going to do mindfulness exercises with you, and then check in with you, right? How you feel. And, there's this scaling thing, like, how do you feel 1 to 5, before you do this exercise, this breathing exercise, or this visual, guided visual kind of exercise. And then sort of checking in afterwards and seeing, what's different. These are all free coaching programs. So,
Very nice.
if somebody doesn't really think they have a counseling need, like they don't have something that's really impacting them, then they can take these programs, and they're very educational. Something I didn't realize, but it's been, interesting, is folks often will take those programs, and then from that, as they start to reflect more on some of the things going on in their life, then they do realize there is something I want to work on and do, go more in depth. So it's been a great way to, open the door for therapy as an option, right? Because like I said, I think everyone should have a therapist, whether you need it at a given time or not, that's up to you, but ready access. And so, we're trying to, I say often, we're trying to give people more tools for their toolbox, right? So if you encounter a stressful situation or a situation that makes you angry, what are some techniques and tools you can use in those situations? And so that was the idea behind those coaching. Like, you're actually working with someone live. Great if you can do it yourself. Great if you can do self-help and follow that app and do it on your own. But for those that maybe struggle with that, we have that resource.
But these would be like beneficial for thousands of people. How can they get access to it? Like,
they can do a self-referral. We have this secured encrypted form on our website, movingforward.help, HELP. That's preferred, right? Because they can kind of, choose the option they want, and then it actually comes to me, and then I can assign it to one of our counselors,
Okay.
or one of our coaches in that case. And so they can self-refer or they can call. As I mentioned, we are, a nonprofit. We have very limited funds. And so we don't have admin. So we have like a messaging service. So people can call and leave a message, and we'll get back to them typically within a day. So they can call, they can go online and do the self-referral, or agencies, if they want to refer somebody with permission from the client, they can do a referral. Or they can email as well.
We'll make sure to put the website link in the description and contact information for moving forward for the viewers. This is a really insightful tool to open up. TV would agree, right?
Yeah, definitely, I do.
I wish again that we could have these in the schools, and I know in certain pockets, in certain places they do. What I've always heard is that there's a struggle because there's so much curriculum that's already in the school system. So it's not that there's a recognition that these are important. It's just that's always been the issue, and it's a bit of a bureaucracy where it's like, okay, yes, it's important, but so are these other courses that have existed, and so that's been the difficulty, is getting it into the school system. So instead of waiting for that to happen, we figured we could try to do something on our own.
For these courses, like, have you tried to collaborate with any of the universities?
Something, again, I think you maybe heard it, and I don't mean this, in a negative way, because I've always, seen things as challenges to address, but, these kind of established, even government, school, K-12 university, they're pretty large systems, and they're not always quick to adapt or change. And they tend to be reactive, right? Like, things have to get to, unfortunately, sometimes a bit of a critical stage before there's a recognition that we need to do something different. I get it, but I don't think that's how it should be. I think we need to be proactive. We need to be downstream on a lot of these things. So not to, degrade any system, because I think there's a lot of great people, as I've said, that are doing great work. People care. Systems,
they're heavy machinery and rigid processes, I would agree. But there's a need to shift from a reactive to proactive, as you said. And
and we can do it, right? So that's where it's like, we will openly collaborate. We have great relationships now, I can say, with a lot of post-secondary institutions.
Okay.
I mean, we have a lot of students from these places that we're working with. And so it's not that the relationships aren't strong, it's just things move slowly. So it's like, in the meantime, here's what we'll do. And then over time, if we can make it more integrated, then great.
This was really an insightful session. Thank you so much for your time, Gary.
Well, we know there's these issues in our communities. So what can we do to reduce stigma? What can we do to reduce barriers? And that's the part that, again, is energizing, because there's more of us that want to do it that way. That I feel optimistic that we are definitely trending in the right direction.
And major takeaways from the session, for example, first would be the 1-point stop that you said, in which the stigmas and anxieties would be eliminated, because a person would be going to see his medical doctor, and it would be like there's some thought fodder, and right, and some few last questions I would like to ask is, if you're comfortable, you've opened up about your better half's loss back in 2017, if I'm not wrong. And any advice for people who have gone through such a big loss in life, because not everyone is able to get back up and live the life. You understand what I'm trying to get at. So what advice would you give to them? Because it affects a lot of people, and this valuable advice may affect them in a positive way.
Well, I can share that, and this is something I even, a year or two ago, I really struggled to talk about, and I still, to some degree, feel it. It was my spouse that passed away, and she died of a horrible illness called frontal temporal dementia. And she was in her mid-30s when she was diagnosed. And I often say, the chance of being hit by lightning twice would be more common than having dementia at that age. And there's no cause of it. And so, for me, it was, as someone that wants answers and wants to understand things, that was my struggle, is how did this happen? And how do we slow its progression down? But unfortunately, there was nothing to slow the progression. And in fact, the younger somebody is with that diagnosis, the faster it tends to progress. So basically, she lost the ability to speak and even feed herself and take care of herself. And this was an incredibly strong person. She was a teacher, and just, I learned so much from her about how to engage with our children, because I always worked with adults. And so she was just so wonderful in so many ways. And, and at the time when this was happening, I was, thinking, well, I kind of know what I need to do. I have resources, right? Initially, when the symptoms first appeared, they very much mimicked mental health. And so I was able to get her in to see a psychiatrist. I was able to get testing done because I could afford it. Mm-hmm. And so I also, in those experiences, I reflected that it was because of the people I knew and my financial ability to do that. But there's a lot of people that absolutely can't do that, right? Mm-hmm. And so and there's a lot of people that are out there that are struggling. I'm not saying obviously everyone has the same condition. This was really rare, but there are conditions that people have. It could be brain injury, it could be just significant mental health, and they deserve help. And too often they're not getting it, right? I was able to do it again because of the people I knew and my financial circumstances. And despite being in this field and having done this work, I also, turned to, alcohol as a way to cope at times. And I would justify it initially like it's just wine and it's, things that I knew that, okay, these are just excuses, but that's what I was doing. And it progressively, increased. And so I got to a point where I had to step back and say, okay, this is problematic. And I'm relying on this to kind of, cope with my emotions. And I was still doing therapy, and I was still, I was engaging with others to kind of do self-care, but it took a toll. And so, I struggle still. I mean, I miss her dearly, and there's sometimes sights or sounds or memories or whatever that can just come up, and they can be, they used to almost be debilitating in the past. Now they're a little bit more manageable. So anyway, I always had empathy for people and their struggles, and then when I experienced it myself, it just increased my empathy and my in many ways, it also made me a little bit more, maybe not the most pleasant sometimes, because, like when I would talk to people in government or these systems and say, well, there's a lot of people suffering, let's do something about it. And they would say, well, there's nothing we can do. Mm-hmm. Suddenly that wasn't an acceptable answer. And maybe mm-hmm. I was channeling my own frustrations and my own grief and my own anger with what was happening to my spouse. But I in some ways, I channeled a lot of that into this kind of like, no, wait a minute, we can do something. Yeah. It's too easy to just say that, oh no, we can't do anything, or our policy or procedures don't allow us to work with this population, or that's not our mandate. I'm like, these are all arbitrary decisions. Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to accept that anymore, right? So like, that's what I mean. I wasn't always the most pleasant, and sometimes, I might have upset some people, but I'm okay with that because it was genuinely about helping and supporting people. So anyway, she passed away in 2017. I started the agency in 2016. So I was already kind of going in this direction, but I took a lot of that and tried to channel it into something productive, while also, having moments of self-destructive behavior, sometimes a lot more than moments, frankly. Yeah. And yet grateful that I was able to access, the resources I had, and recognizing not everyone can do that. And her name was Cindy, and we have a center in her honor that works with children and youth through the agency. So that's, something as well that I've been able to do is to honor her legacy and her memory through the center. But again, not forgetting that
Right.
it's hard to, I had privileges that allowed me to kind of do certain things that I know a lot of people can't. They can't afford therapy, they can't afford private testing, they can't get in to see a psychiatrist. These are systems issues that I don't think, there's too much suffering that takes place as a result.
Right.
Thank you
And
for sharing that.
thank you, and prayers to the family. And she must be really happy and blessing all these ventures of moving forward and contribution to the society. And yeah, and what is important that I've taken away is for the viewers also. In such a case, you need to channel your energy into something constructive, kind of something positive, because that is necessary. And Gary, the work you are doing is just commendable, and you're one of the pillars of society the society can fall back on. Very few people are doing such kind of work, and we thank you from all our hearts. And it's been a pleasure to talk to you and get these insights. People will see this podcast, watch and view and listen this podcast, and would be inspired, which would be made aware to take action. And thank you. Can't stress it enough. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Gary.
Thank you. I will. Thank you so much. I welcome anybody to reach out. I mean, I like to think I'm very accessible.
Yeah.
If people want to connect, I'm happy to connect, especially about how we can just support each other.
Great.